I'm here today with Erin and Sherry, both CFP professionals at Crew Invest, and we're going to be speaking about the process of winding up an estate, what administration is involved, and what costs are involved. Let's start at the beginning. Sherry, where do you report the death and when?
Thank you so much, Hannah. I think, the death of a loved one can be a very trying time. So in terms of reporting the death of a loved one must be reported within 14 days of their passing. The death can be reported can be a surviving spouse, it can be a relative, it can also be anyone who is with your will. In terms of the master's office that the death needs to be reported to, it has to be the master's office within the jurisdiction that you were resident 12 months prior to your passing.
The process of winding up an estate seems quite complex. Is my appointed executor guaranteed to be the executor of my estate? And what happens if I don't appoint one?
Great question. So often clients want to appoint a family member or a close friend as executor. And what they don't realize is there's no guarantee that this person will be appointed. So what needs to happen is the executor that is nominated in your will, if there is one, they need to apply to the master's office to be appointed as executor. If the master is satisfied, they will issue a letter of executorship, which then gives them the powers of administering your estate. But if the master is not satisfied that they have the required expertise and skills, they could insist that another person be appointed with those required expertise and skills to help your estate be administered. If there is no appointed executor or you die without a valid will, the master can appoint an executor to your estate, or if there is no one to be appointed, he could ask your family members to appoint someone. If there is a dispute between your family members, the spouse is seen as somebody who would automatically step in, or their representative as the executor.
Thank you, Erin. So while my estate would be being wound up, what happens to the assets in my estate, specifically my bank account?
That's a very good question, and I think a lot of people underestimate the process when it comes to bank accounts. So in theory, Hannah, your bank accounts will be frozen upon death. No funds or assets are to be withdrawn from a deceased estate without the permission of the master. But different bank accounts or different banks have got different regulations because they understand that this can be a tricky time for the surviving spouse, particularly where you're married in community of property. So the surviving spouse will need access, or in most cases, they'll definitely need access to accounts and banks and funds, and different banks treat this differently. But in essence, the deceased estate will be frozen once the banks have been notified of the death, following which the process of accessing funds should go through the master from there onwards. Yeah.
And tell me, Erin, is it as simple as just having a will in place, or is there anything else that I should consider?
So I think an estate plan is really important to consider, not necessarily after you've drafted your will, but before you draft your will, because a good understanding of the different costs involved or the different maintenance obligations you might have is really important, because this could affect the liquidity within your estate. And could have the unintended consequences of liquidating assets that you might not want to liquidate, or could affect the nominations that you make to your will, because certain costs are preferenced over the distribution of your estate. So it's really important to do an estate plan, not just after you've drafted a will, but I would say even before you draft one, to understand that your wishes can be executed and that there's enough liquidity to cover the costs.
And as someone that's helping someone wind up an estate, is there a process that should be followed when winding up an estate or assisting someone winding up an estate?
So there is a process, and it can be quite a lengthy process. It's very difficult to give timelines. An estate process could take anywhere from a couple of months to a number of years. So what you could expect to happen is, if you had a professional appointed executor or fiduciary services helping you, there'd be an initial meeting where the executor would discuss with the family what to expect, what documents are required to report the estate to the master. You would then need to have the executor appointed, and you can't start working on this estate until the letter of executorship is received. Once that happens, it would be advertised for creditors. The liquidation and distribution account will be prepared and will be reported to the master. Once they're happy with that, it again lays being advertised. After that process, your executor can start distributing the assets in accordance with your will, at which point the executor can then start closing off the estate. So as you can hear, it's quite a lengthy process.
And maybe just to add to what Erin is saying, there are assets that do not form part of your deceased estates. For example, retirement funds. Those are governed by the Section 37C of the Pension Funds Act. So what this essentially means is that they're not governed as per your will, but rather than the trustees of the retirement fund will oversee that distribution process. And depending on how you look at it, it might take longer or shorter. It might be a longer or shorter process to access these funds. Is the maximum or it can take is about 12 months. And then we also have living annuities, Hannah, where if you have a nominated beneficiary on your living annuity, that also does not form part of your deceased estate. If, for example, you had tax-deductible contributions that were accrued from your retirement funds.
Sherry raises a very important point, Another thing to consider would be life annuities as well, where the life company would actually pay those proceeds to your nominated beneficiaries. So there are instances where certain proceeds or certain assets can be paid out without needing to wait for your estate to be wound up.
Sure, so there's quite a few things to consider. Thank you, Erin and Sherry. Are there any other key takeaways from today's discussions? Any last points to add before closing off?
Just to end it off, I think I'll just say losing a loved one is already it's a hard process. It's emotionally difficult, financially difficult. So it's always recommended that you seek a professional, someone who's neutral, to come and assist through the process. Have your will in place, and in that process as well, in drafting your will, like Erin said, have a professional overlook the will, because you do not want unnecessary delays when the time comes. And I think lastly, doing those estate planning analysis, sit down with your financial planner and have a rough idea of what your estate would look like upon death. I think that will have your family better prepared in the event of your passing.